Hey team, we're going to learn how we can dynamically add a table of contents to static HTML in a Next.js React app. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe for future updates. When working with web apps, typically we bring in some kind of dynamic data, such as my blog post here, where I'm pulling in my content directly from WordPress when I'm compiling it inside of Next.js. Now, if we look inside of WordPress, this is kind of similar to what you would see on most headless CMS options, but if we actually look at what data we're querying using GraphQL, we can see here that when we query for all my posts, the way that I get all of the content for each post is static HTML. This is very similar to how things work with my Next.js WordPress starter, where similar to spacejelly.dev, I'm pulling in headless WordPress in order to add the content to a page. And if we look at what that actually looks like in the page, I'm taking that content and I'm dangerously setting that as HTML inside of my React node. But what that means is I'm not doing anything special with that. I'm just taking it as an HTML string and passing it to React, where it then takes that and renders it for me. But that can seem somewhat limiting, as we just have that HTML string to work with, where, like spacejelly.dev, I want to be able to add a dynamic table of contents, or really any other kind of dynamic feature that would actually have to get added inside of the HTML that I get from the server. So to do that, we're going to use a tool called Rehype, which is an HTML processor that's part of the Unified.js collective. And while there's a whole lot to unwrap between Rehype and the Unified collective, what we're essentially going to do is use two plugins as part of Rehype, where we have our parse, which is going to take an HTML string and turn it into a syntax tree. And then we're going to take that syntax tree after we've done our transformations and turn it back into an HTML string and pass it right back. Now, if you've never heard of Rehype before, you might have heard of Remark inside of the Gatsby and Next.js world, where it's a very similar tool except it processes Markdown. But because we ultimately get our HTML as a string instead of Markdown, we want to be able to use Rehype to do that processing for us. Now, to test this out, we're going to use Next.js, which, if you're not familiar, is a React framework, which is going to allow us to provide a powerful web application with just a few commands. Now, you can create your Next.js application from scratch using create next app, but we're going to create our application using a starter that I set up, which really just provides a base level for what we're going to be able to do with our application, which is really starting us off with a point where we're ingesting static HTML for us to use instead of having to worry about connecting a separate data point. If you want to follow along, you can find the link to this repository and the instructions on how to get started right in the description. But I'm going to start off by grabbing this yarn command, and feel free to use npm or npx if that's what you prefer. I'm going to paste that in, and I'm going to call it my Rehype app. What this is going to do is it's going to grab this starter template that I created, it's going to pull it down locally, creating a new project, and it's going to go ahead and install all the dependencies so that we're going to be ready to go as soon as this is done. But now I can cd into my application and I can run yarn dev, which is going to start a development server, where if I open this up, we can see that inside of the browser, it's going to compile the basic site. And once it loads, we can see that we have a really basic site here where all I'm doing is I'm pulling in statically some example content from spacejelly.dev, but just loading it up inside of a Next.js application, which we're going to be able to use to work through this project. And we can see exactly that. If we open up the source for the application, we can see that on the index.js file, we're pulling in our post data from this data post.json, which again, this looks just like the response that you saw when we were looking inside of the GraphQL query, where we have our HTML as a string, which was what we're going to use to process our actual HTML. But inside of our application, we can see that we're pulling that in and we're adding it as data so that we can loop through, grab our posts. And similarly, if we actually look at the dynamic route for the post page, we can see we're doing the exact same thing where we're grabbing that particular post, we're passing it in the prop, and then finally we have it where we're passing it as HTML, just like spacejelly.dev and the Next.js WordPress starter, right into React. Now, starting from the top, we want to be able to create an actual processing pipeline, where if we head over to Rehype, again, I mentioned earlier Unified, we want to create a unified pipeline where we then use Rehype to plug in and actually use its power to process our HTML. Now, one thing to note here is these libraries are ESM only, and it's requiring Node 12 or above. So make sure that we're using the import statements, which will be in our example, but make sure that you're using that when we're actually running through our example, or else you might run into issues. But to start off, we need 3 main packages for our first pipeline to get set up, where we want to look through and we want to add unified, we want to add our Rehype parse, which is going to be allowing us to grab that HTML and turn it into our syntax tree, and then finally stringify, where we're going to take that syntax tree and we're going to turn it back into that static HTML string. So in my terminal, I'm going to add my unified, Rehype parse, and Rehype stringify. Now, once that's done, I want to head back over to my code editor and I'm going to import those libraries, where we can see that we're destructuring unified from the unified package. We're importing Rehype parse from Rehype parse, and we're importing Rehype stringify from Rehype stringify. Now, looking at the example on Rehype parse, we're going to do something similar, but not exactly the same, as this one is using remark in the example. But we can see here that we're starting off with this unified pipeline that it's creating. And then we're using a bunch of the plugins, which we're going to pass in, that's going to allow us to process our file, which in our instance is going to be that HTML string. So I'm going to paste this snippet in just because there's a lot there to try to type out through this video, but I want to show you that we're currently creating that unified pipeline just like we were inside of that example that we were showing. We're then going to use that Rehype parse library, and we can see here that we're passing in this fragment true property, where this is going to tell Rehype parse that we don't want to pass in a complete HTML document, we're only going to pass in a fragment of a document. We're then going to use a second use function, where here we're passing in a custom new function. This way we can kind of see what that tree looks like when we're first going to look at it in the browser. And then we're going to use the Rehype stringify plugin, which once we parse it, we do our processing, we're going to turn it back into a string. And then finally, we're going to kick off that process by passing in our content as an argument by using the process sync function. And then finally to string, which then uses that plugin for us. Now, I know that was a lot to digest, so make sure you pause if you need to take a second to catch up, but we want to make sure that we're starting off our pipeline and we're going through all the plugins, and we're going to have that middle step, which is where we're going to put our custom logic, and then we're ultimately going to process it and turn it into a string. And we can see that we return all of this into a new constant called content, which is what we're ultimately going to use. We can even prove that this is going to work by we're going to take that constant of content, we're going to scroll down and we're going to simply update our HTML that we're passing in to that content, because when it comes out, it's going to be that HTML string that we're going to use. Now, if we open up the app in the browser, we shouldn't actually see any differences yet, as we are passing it through that pipeline, but we're not doing any transformations. But if we open up our terminal with that console log in there as I had it, we can see that we now have this tree, where if we start opening up some of these directories, we can see that we have a bunch of elements and text nodes, and this is all the content or a tree that's making up this page that we have here. Like if we look through these a couple ones, we have our element, which is a paragraph tag, which ultimately we see this first paragraph of browsers ship with a ton of ways. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of a syntax tree, what we're looking at here is our tree, where if we see this children property and we start drilling down, we can see that we have our elements and then we have children of our elements, where it's going to create a tree effect of all the different nodes that actually make up the content inside of our application. But ultimately, we don't want to have to work through every single one of these in order to do our processing. In our example, we're going to create a table of contents, and the first step is going to be to add IDs to each of the headers, and we're only going to process the H2 headers. So we want to try to filter this down so that we're only looking at those H2s. While you can certainly do this without any kind of library, we have some tools available to us like this utility, where we're going to be able to visit each of those nodes and perform transformations as a function, and we can even use its functionality to test or actually filter out what nodes or elements that we want to use. This is a very common way to do this kind of thing within the unified collective. So we're going to take this and we're going to install it. So in my terminal, I'm going to add that package. I'm going to add it as a dependency, where we can see here, again, we're destructuring our visit from this package. And then inside of this function that we're returning as part of our use, where we're going to do our transformations, we're going to run that visit function. And we're going to use 3 arguments for this function, where the first thing we're going to do is pass in our tree so that visit can go through each of the nodes as part of that. Then the second argument is going to be a string, which we're going to pass in as element. And as we saw inside of the browser, if we look back at our application, we saw that we have a bunch of different text and also the element nodes, as well as a few different others. But particularly, we want to look for these H2s. So we want to look for the different elements. And then third, we want to pass in a function, which is where we're going to actually do our processing and transformations. But then we're going to receive a node as an argument to that callback function. So I'm going to instead log out all those nodes and see what it looks like. And if we refresh the page and look inside the browser, we can see inside of the console that we only have elements. Now again, we only want the H2s, so we want to try to make sure we're only grabbing the tag names of H2. Now technically, we can pass in a function as our second argument and do all of our logic there, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to start off by adding node tag name and checking if that is equal to H2, and then if it is, I'm only going to log those nodes. And again, if I refresh the page, we can see we have only elements, and we now only have H2s. So next, we ultimately want to add IDs to each one of these H2s so that we can jump down to it inside of the document. Now to do that, we need to create some kind of unique identifier that we can add as an ID. And the way we're going to handle that, which is pretty common, is to actually use the text of the header. Now, if you notice, this has a special character in it, and typically when we're using HTML text, we might also see other special characters. So what we want to do is make sure that we transform this text into a friendly, URL-friendly ID string. Now again, this is yet another thing that you can do without a library, but I prefer to use this package called parameterize, which is actually originally from the Ruby on Rails ecosystem, but what it's going to do is it's going to take our string, strip any special characters, and turn it into a parameterized string that we can use as part of our header ID, which will also work as a jumping point for our URL. So again, I'm going to install this package by running yarn add parameterize. I'm going to go ahead and import it into my project, where now we want to grab this node's text. If we look at how this looks inside of our actual browser, we can see that we have this children array where the first index is going to be the type of text, but it's going to have a value of that text. So inside this block, I'm going to create a new ID. I'm going to run the function parameterize, and inside of that, I'm going to pass in node.children, and again, we're accessing that children array where we want to grab that 0 index, and then we want to grab the value of that. And let's log that out instead and see what that looks like. We can see that we get this list of IDs that look exactly like all the different headers as we're scrolling down through this app, except what it's going to do is it's going to allow us to use these inside of the URL. So now that we have our IDs, let's actually add them to the node. So to do that, we're going to access the properties of our node. And all we need to do is run node.properties and then simply set the ID equal to our ID. And now if we actually inspect one of those headers, we can see right in the HTML that we have that ID. And better yet, if we copy that ID, and let's scroll back up to the top, and at the very end of my URL, I paste in hashtag that ID, it's going to jump me down right to that page. And just to make sure that this is actually working properly, I'm going to open a new tab and do the same thing, but we can see it jumps down right to that section instead of the top of the page, which loads by default. So now we can see that we're collecting all of those headers and we're also generating IDs. So this is fundamental to how we're going to create our table of contents, which we can do next. So don't worry, we're not going to install any more libraries if that was a lot for you. But what we're going to do is at the top of our post component, we're going to start off by creating a variable called TOC, and we're going to set that equal to an empty array. Now with our TOC array or table of contents array, we're going to add the content of each one of these nodes to that TOC as an object so that later we can loop through and use it. So after I have this ID and setting the ID property, I'm going to add toc.push, and then inside of that, I'm going to first set that ID, and I'm going to simply pass it in as is, and then I'm going to pass in a title where we're going to set that equal to the same thing that we created the parameter from, which is going to be the value of that header. Now, if we scroll down to our page underneath our H1, or really you can add this wherever you want, I'm going to actually paste in this snippet, but all I'm doing here is I'm creating an unordered list and I'm taking that TOC array and I'm mapping through it, where for each one, I'm creating a new list item where I'm passing in the key of the ID, but then I'm also creating an anchor tag where as the href, I'm creating dynamically this string where I'm using that hashtag like we saw in the browser, but I'm also passing the ID dynamically right after that. And finally, we're passing in the title so that we have the accurate header inside the table of contents. And once we reload the page, we can see that we now have that list of all those items. And better yet, if we click one of them, like maybe I want to skip to step 4, if I click that, we can see it jumps right down to step 4. Now, this is working really great as is, but another cool feature that we can add is if you've been to other websites like GitHub, you might have noticed that they have little links next to the header where if you click it, it's going to set up that bookmark so you can easily copy and paste that from your URL. To see what I mean, over on GitHub, if we scroll down on my Next.js WordPress starter site, we can see that if we hover over any of these titles, we have this little link icon where if we click it, it's going to add that ID similar to how we're adding an ID right to the URL, where now I can take that and I can paste it into another tab and it's going to work. It's really just a nice little UX feature that helps people try to bookmark a particular place inside of the application. But if we inspect how GitHub's actually doing this, we can look through and we find our H2 where we can see that it's generating an ID similar to how we're generating ID, but it's adding this anchor tag right to the beginning of that element node where it's going to allow us to hover over and actually click on that link. Now, looking back at our blog for a second, if we look at the nodes that we're having inside for our headers, we can see we have this children array where inside we have this text element for our text. But what if we wanted to add another element, which is how we're going to accomplish adding this anchor tag dynamically into our different headers. So we're going to access the same node.children array where I'm going to say node.children and I'm going to use the unshift method, which is going to add whatever we send here to the beginning of the array. And next we want to try to copy what we're seeing here as a typical element node. Now again, I'm going to paste in this object, but what we're going to do is we're going to create a new node via an object where we're going to pass in the node as a type of element, similar to what we saw inside of the term or in the web console, but this time it's going to have a tag name of A, which is for an anchor tag, where we're then going to pass in a few different properties, where we have our href like we saw inside of the table of contents that we created, very similar. We then have a CSS class that we're going to add, and in particular, we can see that we have our styles.anchor here. This is because we're using the CSS modules that come with part of Next.js. If you're using something else, like with a typical React, you might just use a typical class name as a string when you're passing it in there. But then finally, we're going to pass in aria hidden with a value of true because we don't want this to necessarily come up on things like a screen reader, as it doesn't really add any semantic value to the actual blog. Again, if we look inside of the console, we can see that looks very similar where we have our type of element, our tag name where we're passing in our anchor tag, but then we have our properties where we can set up all those different fields. But now that our page has a chance to reload, we can now inspect that H2, and if we open it up inside, we can see we have that anchor tag right at the beginning of our H2. But what we don't see is we don't see that anchor tag, and that's because we don't actually have any content in it yet. Now, opening up our home.module.css, I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom where I'm going to start to add my CSS. First, I want to add a pseudo before element to actually add in that content, where I'm going to say I want my content to be a hashtag, and you can use whatever character you want here, where then I'm going to say I want the color to be gray. Now, making sure we can see all this content, we see that we do have our little gray hashtag inside of our header. But depending on how you want this to look, maybe you want it to look like GitHub, where you only see it when you hover over it and you see it kind of floating off to the left. So I'm going to say that I want this to actually float left inside of the actual DOM, but what I also want to do is I want to add some padding right to it to space it away from my title, and I'm going to add 8 pixels in there, and that's not a magic number, I know this from beforehand, but then I want to also pull it away from the header, and I'm going to add a margin left, and I'm going to say -33 pixels, which is going to pull it off so that's still nicely aligned in the actual flow of the document. Then I'm going to take all those CSS properties and I'm going to paste it in to my actual anchor class. Now, again, we're following along with the GitHub example, but I don't want this to show until I actually hover on. So first, we can actually take this before element, we can add visibility of hidden. And for this one, I'm going to simply just type that right in. Now to actually make it visible, we're going to target the H2 and we're going to say whenever we hover over our H2, we want to target that before element inside to make it visible again. Now we could probably come up with some kind of selector that we can use our H2, but let's just add a new class name to all of our headers so that we can target exactly what we need. So under where I'm setting up my node properties ID, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it for class, where to make sure we're not showing an undefined value, I'm going to first check to see if a class already exists. And if it does exist, I'm going to pass in a dynamic string of that class along with another dynamic value of styles.header. But if it doesn't exist, I'm going to pass in simply styles.header. Then back in my CSS, I'm going to say for my header, anytime someone hovers over it, I want to also target this anchor tags before element, where inside I'm going to say I want to set the visibility to visible. And if we look in the app, we can see that our header already has that class name, but when we hover over, we can see our anchor tag. And we can even see that if we click it, it's going to update our URL just like it would with a bookmark. So we can then copy and paste that to send over to our friends, or just to make sure that we have it in the place where we last left off. Now, adding a table of contents along with all these IDs is a great, simple, and practical way to see the power of how the Rehype processing power works, but there's so much more that you can do with it. For instance, Rehype actually has a React plugin, so if you want to add some React magic to it, you can add that right into the actual processing pipeline. Now, one thing to also know as part of the solution that we work through is we can see that we were doing this right inside of the React component, and that's not necessarily the most performant way to do this kind of thing. Instead, what we can do is we can take this and take advantage of the data fetching methods like getStaticProps, where it's only going to actually run that cost of processing that HTML once. That way we're not having to reprocess it every time this component renders. Just because we're using static HTML as a string in order to provide the content to our pages doesn't mean that we don't have the flexibility to do dynamic things. What's your favorite use case, or what kind of cool ideas do you have where you can take your HTML string and process it to add things like a table of contents, or even if you wanted to add a nice code snippet where you even have a little button to click to copy? If you want to learn more about how you can query your WordPress data with GraphQL, or use my Next.js WordPress starter to bootstrap really quickly, make sure you check out my video with the link above. Or click above to learn how you can level up your CSS with Sass. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up and subscribe for future updates. Thanks for watching.